James awoke to the loud beeping of his phone's alarm the next morning with an aching neck and a dry mouth, going back and forth between feeling good about having his beautiful girlfriend cuddle up to him, and cursing the world because it was way too warm for any of this, and he already felt like his side was actively melting off of him. Carefully, he began to wriggle himself out of a hold, scooting to the side on his back to go and freshen himself up. Obviously, not even his ultimately best efforts would keep him from waking up Sheeta in the process, and so he accepted his fate early and just got it over with, sliding out of the bed swiftly and airing himself out a bit from the sheer amount of heat he had absorbed over the night. Sheeta opened her eyes slowly, taking the room in more with her ears turning every which way, while she excessively yawned as she got to the process of getting her body going for the day. But as soon as they got to their feet and managed to lumber over to the tiny but surprisingly functional bathroom that was attached to their room, a bit of cold water swiftly kick-started their systems. It was a slight damper on the mood that they had no fresh change of clothes with them. However, they would make do for the moment, at least until they returned to their actual hotel and could get ready for the day properly. And so, they packed up the few personal items they had brought with them and left the room to hopefully meet up with everyone else. James fully expected the two of them to be the last to get up. However, just to be sure, he went along the others' room's doors and gave them a few heavy knocks to hopefully startle everyone into action who had somehow managed to oversleep. He had not heard any other alarms going off. However, he attributed that to the apparently very soundproof walls of the establishment that were likely also necessary, given the quite vocal nature of Miat. But just as he had expected, everyone seemed to be primed and more than ready to leave this place. Not that it hadn't been hospitable, but they were seriously out of their element here. While they grouped up in the brothel's main room in order to fully clarify their plan going forward, James observed Sheeta momentarily slipping away to exchange some words with the establishment's madame. The older woman seemed amused and more than once giggled into her hand in an artificial way, while she answered Sheeta's apparent inquiries. Meanwhile, Sheeta's expression seemed to turn into mild concern. Finally, she said something with a nod of her head, which made the madam shrug dismissively before she turned away, most likely to go take care of whatever business had to be taken care of in the morning in a place like this. James excused himself from the group with a quick hand movement before briefly walking over to Sheeta, who had her lips curled in a ruminative expression while picking at the hairline around her nape with an extended claw. "Something the matter?" he asked, deliberately casual, putting a hand on her busy shoulder, which made her turn towards him. "I just asked about the news since the room didn't have any receivers," she said, the thoughtfulness on her face clearing up for the most part. "Seems a bunch of new faces have been added to the bounty board since yesterday." James pursed his lips disapprovingly, although it admittedly didn't surprise him. The protesters had gone against the most powerful man on the planet, and that quite publicly. If sanctioned vigilantism was normalized on this planet, he almost couldn't think of a more fitting target for it, even if the thought was averse to him. "Any of us on there?" he asked facetiously, hoping to lighten the air a bit while simultaneously praying to entities he didn't believe in that he hadn't accidentally spoken something into existence, although it was likely that Sheeta's reaction would have been a lot extremer, had that much been the case. And indeed, Sheeta rolled her eyes in very slight amusement. "Not yet," she replied matter-of-factly, and stopped her nervous scratching, retracting her claw and letting her hand sink down again. But the prices indicate that someone's pissed. James raised an eyebrow. "How much?" he asked, in a mild bout of curiosity. "Converted up to 5 million UC for the high-priority targets," Sheeta replied, in an almost hand-waving way. If James had been drinking at the time, he might have had to hold back a real-life spit take. "Wow, he is pissed," he said awkwardly, and rubbed the back of his head with his mechanical hand. 5 million for some protesters? He remembered his own little misadventure on the GCS causing an estimated damage of around 7 million. Admittedly not exactly an unheard of, or even exorbitant amount of money, far from it for some people, especially richest man on the planet kind of people. But still, well, I guess he can afford it. How many fetch bounties like that? "At least 100 people from what the madame told me," Sheeta said, brushing her hair, that was slowly turning wild again the longer they remained out of human space, back with both hands to keep her face and ears mostly free of it. "Apparently the bounty section took almost 10 times as long as usual today." James hummed in acknowledgement. If he's willing to fork over that much for victims of circumstance, Sheeta then mused aloud with a brief chuckle, and folded her hands behind her head while stretching her elbows forwards. Imagine the kind of cash he'd hand out for the people causing all his problems. Inadvertently, James's eyes scanned around the room, trying to locate the cameras that had spotted them coming in the previous day. It didn't take long until his gaze fell onto the slight sheen of the light's reflection in the polished lens that was semi-hidden in one of the room's darker corners. He suspected that Amiat might have had some problems making it out without actively searching for it, but to his human eyes it was quite obvious. He wondered if they were watching them today as well. Obviously they couldn't have an eye on the footage all the time, but, well, he sure felt watched, even if that was most likely just his paranoia. "Let's not give him any ideas," he said half-jokingly, before making a hand gesture towards the rest of their group, indicating that they should probably join up with everyone again. She'd concurred with a nod, and together they sauntered over to the group, where they had apparently missed a good part of a quite fascinating conversation. "A server room?" Andrej asked, an incredulous look projected onto the visor of his filter as he crossed his arms and tilted his head to the side. "Looked pretty secure for that, didn't it?" To that, Amish shook his head, and James imagined him rolling his eyes underneath his mask, even if the projection of his face didn't transmit that much. "Obviously it was upgraded and fortified," he replied, in a surprisingly professional manner given his seemingly annoyed demeanour, his voice remaining firm and to the point. "But still, after a night of looking into it, it basically has to be." "Well," Tuya then jumped in, slightly hesitant, although she clearly had something to say, as she lifted her right hand in an almost offering manner. "That would explain the weird layout, constant humming and strange location. Easier to keep stuff cool when you already have cool air." Andrej took in their explanations ruminatively, before glancing over at Athena, who simply shrugged. "They know more about that stuff than I do," she admitted unabashedly, not at all interested in throwing her superior rank around on the topic she understood little about. "What server room?" James then used the opportunity to chime in, not quite getting what this was about, although the bits of information he had picked up already gave him a vague idea. Andrej nodded. "Apparently, that's what that building that Zishidi had us fly out to was." He filled James in on the blanks. James scrunched up his brow. "Really? That's what that place had been?" Admittedly, it did make sense when he thought about the endless hallways with regularly dispersed rooms, but why was Zishidi hunkered down in a server room of all places? "Probably something we can worry about in the privacy of our own rooms," he finally decided, with another glance over at the ever-observing cameras all around them, and it seemed that Andrej had no objections there. "Are we ready to head out?" The shuttle doors opened loudly, as the ramp lowered to release the new arrivals that it brought onto this strange world. Flanked by 3 of his comrades, Alexander shielded his eyes from the harsh light that Satek shone down onto the planet's surface. On his way here, he had been informed that, although he had arrived sooner than his allies' accessories, it had not been soon enough to get ahead of his conspecifics, who had already been mingling with the locals for quite a while at this point. It didn't matter. Although this was a strange world, he held the home field advantage. He would just have to make use of that. And it would certainly help that his fellow humans had inadvertently put more than one hurdle in their own way with their reactions to the current political climate. Stepping out of the shuttle and onto the brightly coloured pavement of the spaceport, he immediately enjoyed the warm rays of sunshine on his skin. He couldn't have imagined better weather for his arrival, he thought. A bright, sunny day, with not a cloud in the darkly coloured sky. What a beautiful world this was. Feeling the soles of his shoes make contact with the hot pavement, he flexed the muscles in his legs against the gravity, and even hopped in place a few times, feeling pleasantly validated as he barely lifted himself off the ground with the minimal effort he put in. Around here he wouldn't jump with each step he took. A place like home. Inadvertently, his right hand closed around the pendant that hung from his neck, his sharp corners slightly digging into his hand as he pressed it, although not clearly enough to cause any pain. His admiration of his surroundings was soon interrupted, as a dark form slowly sauntered up to him from the side, having apparently waited there since the moment the shuttle had landed. Turning his head, he lay eyes on a heavily tanned Miat with very dark stripes and amber-coloured eyes that studied him curiously. They wore something that looked almost akin to silver armour, giving them a quite regal look as it twinkled in the bright light of the day. In a gesture that didn't seem quite natural but very much intentional, they moved a bit closer and extended a hand to Alexander. "Welcome to Dunimer, Alexander," they greeted, apparently fully informed about who he was and what they had to expect. "I am Lord Javar, representative of the Quarf-Wem Thera Komatapeno. We've been awaiting your arrival." Just minutes later, Alexander and his comrades were already whisked away in a vehicle that looked quite a lot like the cars they had back on Earth, if a bit smoother all around. It seemed these people had a certain dislike for corners of any kind, which made the very rigid and sharp symbol around Alexander's neck stand out quite a bit. As a cross, framed by a downwards pointing pentagram, it basically consisted of nothing but edges and sharp corners. The cityscape flew past them, made up mostly of multi-level buildings reaching high into the sky, as whoever designed them had apparently tried to use the space as efficiently as possible, despite the quite wasteful design of having rounded walls everywhere that couldn't perfectly connect to each other, so they wouldn't form a sharp edge. It reminded of a field of termite hills, all the more so whenever one of the exceptionally large buildings towered over the other ones, dotted all over with tiny, rounded windows like tunnels, leading inside for the insects crawling along its walls. The car finally stopped in front of one of said towers, that pierced highly into the planet's indigo sky. A noticeable amount of seemingly armed and professional security surrounded the building in a wide circle, standing around conspiratorially, and apparently just waiting for something to happen. Alexander wondered what could have prompted such a thing, but as the personnel didn't bother him or his comrades as they were led towards the entrance by Lord Javar, he figured he would probably get an answer to that question quite soon. Despite the brown colour it was painted in, the entire building was seemingly made of steel, glass, brick and mortar, with the notable exception of what seemed to be one half of a tree stump being integrated into the wall, right next to the entrance. Engraved into it was a picture of what seemed to be two hands, held in an almost blessing-like symbolism over a plate with meat, while four other, seemingly unrelated hands tried to reach for it. They were ushered inside and guided through the polished, sand-coloured halls, before arriving at an elevator, the doors of which were rounded like everything else on this planet appeared to be. The interior was polished and sterile, and the ride upwards took multiple minutes, as it seemed that their destination was near the very top of the building. Alexander enjoyed the feeling of his weight pressing down on him after all the time he had spent in the less than up-to-par gravity of a space station. When they finally arrived, and the doors opened for them, they opened to what appeared to be a waiting area. The floor was covered in a thick, red carpet. The walls were masked with dark wood, and the area was furnished in comfortable, padded armchairs and fine-looking coffee tables all around. There were only 3 doors connecting the area to the rest of the world. One was the elevators, another most likely led to some form of staircase, and a third, large and extravagant pair of double doors with gilded locks and handles, stood invitingly on the other side of the room, calling out to anyone who made it to this area to come and try to enter them. While Alexander was still taking in the fascinating picture, Loijavar already stepped out of the elevator with swift steps and made his way towards the doors in a manner that indicated he did so regularly and comfortably. As he had crossed about half of the waiting area, he turned around on the spot and looked back at the people he had been leading here, apparently ensuring that they would keep following him for a while. "Your associates may wait here," the feline then informed, looking directly into Alexander's blue eyes. His associates didn't seem to have a problem with that, as they quickly spread out throughout the room in order to make themselves comfortable in one of the many inviting armchairs. Meanwhile, Alexander himself quickly caught up to Loijavar with swift steps, not wanting to make a bad first impression by loitering around. Together, they then passed the second half of the room, where Loijavar didn't even pause to knock or otherwise make his arrival known. Instead, he immediately reached for the door handles and pushed the massive wooden entrance open, before stepping aside and indicating for Alexander to take the lead from here on. There wasn't much to lead, however, as the doors had revealed a large desk standing only a few paces behind them, with 3 empty seats waiting to be filled on one side of it, while the other was occupied by what had to be the palest of all Miat, sitting there clad in golden armour, and hunched over a piece of paper that he seemed to read with both great interest and scrutiny. He was ripped out of his concentration when his ears twitched upwards in response to the sound of the door being opened, and his pale blue gaze immediately met with that of Alexander. The mighty-looking white lion noticeably pushed himself up into a straighter position, while simultaneously pushing the piece of paper he had been studying aside to make room on his workspace, before invitingly gesturing towards the empty seats. His aged, world-knowing face gave little insight into his thoughts, as he looked at Alexander blankly. However, it seemed that something was troubling him that was not related to the human's arrival. "I never thought I'd have to greet another one of you so soon," the man admitted in a low murmur that sounded almost akin to a growl, as Alexander was still in the process of lowering himself into the seat, with Loijavar dutifully taking up position behind him. Usually we never receive visitors on planet, but now they're coming in like pigs, flocking to a fresh kill. Alexander curiously glanced at the paper the man had previously pushed away from him. He didn't want to stare at it for too long, of course, so he only caught a single glance, but he was quite good in reading even upside down, and from what he read, it seemed to be an invitation of sorts. At least the way it was addressing him made it seem that way. "I've heard about my conspecifics approaching you as well," he then said, turning his attention towards the white lion sitting before him. "I'm here to assure you that you don't have to worry about them in the slightest." Quarf-Wem immediately scoffed at his words, filling that slight gesture with a venom that might have killed lesser beings. He lowered his hand onto the desk's plate, where he rhythmically brought down the sharp points of his claws onto its hard surface. "Why would I be worried about them?" he asked almost mockingly, and dismissively waved the idea with his other hand. "They're diplomats, here to pay a visit and then leave. As long as I don't accept any dealings with them, what is there to worry?" Alexander lifted his lips into a smile, a gesture that Quarf-Wem was apparently not yet used to, as he raised his eyebrows in anticipation of something that wouldn't be coming. Alexander ignored his confusion. "In that case, we can count on your continued support going forward?" he asked, not wanting to give the feline any fodder for possible doubt, as it seemed like he was not at all impressed by whatever the humans had offered him so far. Quarf-Wem furrowed his brow. "I'm not one to pounce onto empty promises," he said confidently, and his eyes briefly shot over to the strange invitation as he did so, before he apparently dismissed whatever thought he had had with an amused shake of his head. "I know how I got where I am. Keep being the best offer and you'll keep my support." He then shifted his head slightly, as an idea seemingly sneaked into his mind. His face turned almost malicious as he leaned forwards, his pale eyes narrowing down onto Alexander in a predatory way. "Or do you actually think the humans could outbid our sponsors?" he added onto his previous statement, with vicious mockery in his voice, that however seemed to hide genuine enticement behind it. "They haven't even made an offer yet." Alexander immediately and loudly laughed off the proposition. "Do you take me for a fool?" he asked facetiously, and gestured his arms outwards in a wide shrug. "I already told you there is nothing to worry about. Under Aldwin's campaign, the human territories have shut down all their trading. There is hardly an offer that they can make without incurring the wrath of their allies." He then brought his hands down again, leaning forward and returning Quarf-Wem's glare with one of his own, holding intense eye contact for a few moments as he continued. "However, that is Aldwin's campaign, and Aldwin isn't the only one looking to represent our people. That's why I was sent here by our shared sponsors. Earth is large. Earth has resources. Earth has people. Earth has money. So far, Earth has kept itself out of the galactic stage for the most part, keeping mostly to itself. I intend to change that. Bring Earth closer to the galaxy." He smiled again, breaking the strong eye contact as he leaned back, folding his hands behind the back of his blonde head. "I've got the backing to do it. You of all people know I do," he added in a more relaxed manner. "And if you want to also add yourself to that, well, I can offer you a large share of our shared wealth." The vicious look on Quarf-Wem's face disappeared near instantly, making way for a thoughtful one as his features softened, and his until then intense glare seemingly drifted off into his own world for a second. "You sound quite sure of yourself," he murmured, and it wasn't clear if he was actually addressing Alexander or just giving voice to his thoughts. Alexander shrugged. "I could have just left it to our sponsors to tell you to support me," he said offhandedly, and closed his eyes for a second. "But I wanted to make sure the two of us would also understand each other as partners, especially since your support could be especially useful to me." Quarf-Wem's eyes returned to reality, coming to a halt on Alexander's face. "Oh?" he asked, and near turning directly forwards expectantly. Alexander nodded. "Humans like what is like us," he said, "and nothing is quite like us like the Miat are. We understand each other?" Quarf-Wem brought 2 fingers to his chin, rubbing it thoughtfully. "Indeed," he mumbled to himself. And, obviously, the Miat would want to support me instead of Ordwin, Alexander carried on, emboldened by Quarf-Wem's seeming amenability. After all, he is here in the name of the human military, which seeks to widen its influence in the search for more cannon fodder in the upcoming conflict, starting with one of the most populated yet isolated planets there is. But of course, your people would never fall for that. A clearly scrutinizing look flashed through Quarf-Wem's eyes, as he seemed to fully take in the whole picture that Alexander presented. Alexander wondered what went through the old predator's mind. However, almost as soon as it had become clear, it already disappeared again, as his features softened into a cheerful expression, with his cheeks slightly raised and ears briefly fluttering, which gave the mighty white lion almost the air of a joyful old man. "We may be both Deathworlders and predators," he said, with a well-acted expression of happiness, "but despite the preconceptions, the Miat are a peaceful people. Of course, we have no interest in further spurring the fires of conflict." Alexander smiled, this time even willing to hide his teeth. "And humanity, the strange yet honored Deathworld primates, will not be led astray by singular bad actors," he added in a cheer. "Our military may want to profit off of conflict, but our people will know better. With the support of the galaxy, of course." The both of them laughed for a second, although admittedly the laughter of the feline sounded a lot more like a spasmodic, dry wheezing. There was everything but appealing. "Well, you have my answer," Quarf-Wem said, after they had calmed down again. "Keep being the best offer and you'll keep my support." He then put his hands down onto the table meaningfully, and pushed himself up. "You must have had a long journey, and I have a lot of work to do right now," he added onto his previous statement, and made an open-handed gesture towards the door. "Why don't you relax before we get into the specifics, while I clear my schedule so we may proceed undisturbed?" As the leader of a planet-spanning corporation, said schedule was likely everything but easy to clear, Alexander figured. And although he was quite good at that very thing, he decided not to push his luck this time. There was no need to rush things. Quarf-Wem had worked with his sponsors for years and years now, and he was a savvy man that knew how to keep his position. So the young blonde man got up from his seat and said his goodbyes with a brief bow, before turning to leave the room. "Will you find your way by yourself?" Nyantaka, who had been near perfectly still while observing the conversation from right behind Alexander, asked, while making way so the human could go unobstructed. Alexander glanced at the man. What was his deal? The silver armor made him seem a lot more important than someone who just stood silently and watched things unfold. Or maybe he just misunderstood some stuff. This was a different planet, after all. "We will be fine," he replied pointedly, also giving the lesser of the two men a short bow before leaving out of the large doors. Quarf-Wem looked after the human for a few moments after he left. Nyantaka did the same, and so the room was silent for some time, until the assistant suddenly broke out into a mild bout of giggling. At first, Quarf-Wem didn't react. However, after just a few more seconds, he also cracked up, although he didn't give voice to his smile. "Quite the character, sir," Nyantaka commented finally, and Quarf-Wem nodded. Absent-mindedly, he reached over his table, pulling the earlier discarded piece of paper back towards him. He looked down at it with a bored expression, skimming over the lines once again. The newly founded coalition of representatives of the Deathworlds would like to invite him as the representative of Dunima. A whole lot of uninteresting nonsense to him, but maybe interesting to someone else. "I'll see what additional information I can compile about Earth and its businesses," Nyantaka commented, unprompted, and opened the large door again in order to step out. Quarf-Wem chuckled. "You always know just what to say." Meanwhile, the group around James was slowly meandering along the streets of Nyantaka, feeling slightly worse for wear in their dirty clothes now that they were out in the day's burning heat that was additionally reflected up at them by the pavement. As always, the city seemed to have magically repopulated as soon as the sun had risen, and so their progress was largely halted by the sheer amount of people all around them also going about that day, doing their work in the city one way or another. They were mostly one and the same. Busy Miat wearing some form of workday clothing with an uninterested, no-nonsense look on their face, making a slight detour around the group of humans without paying much attention to them. Satak was not yet high in the sky, and so the entire group, including even Shida, had put their breath filters back on so they wouldn't be blinded by the star's bright light, as they seemed to be walking directly towards it on their way back to the spaceport. For a moment, it made James wonder. Hadn't there been something about the direction the star was rising in? The answer came soon in the form of high-rising buildings with low ceilings on each of their levels that replaced the general office buildings and storefronts flanking their way on each side so far. James raised his eyebrows underneath his mask. To his shame, he had to admit that he hadn't even noticed that they had walked right past Nyantaka's cramps on their way to their temporary stay last night. Admittedly, they weren't directly on their way, since the city's poorest area lay straight ahead of them, while they would soon have to take a turn to get to the spaceport, but the buildings were admittedly still hard to overlook. Next to him, Shida must have noticed him staring after a few moments, since she seemingly followed his gaze. "Haven't changed a bit," she commented, although it sounded like it was more out of some feeling of obligation to say anything, rather than an actual need to get her thoughts out. Admittedly, James only saw the very tips of the building from where they stood now, but he still found a strange sense of something like second-hand nostalgia taking a hold of him. "That's where you grew up," he mumbled, not quite sure if he should say anything about it, given the way Shida generally talked, or more precisely didn't talk, about her childhood home. Shida just hummed in acknowledgement of his statement, and remained silent for a few seconds. Then, almost out of the blue, she asked, "Want to go take a look at it?" James's hair snapped around towards her fast enough that he heard his vertebrae release loud cracks from the strain. He seriously hadn't expected the suggestion. Are you sure?" he asked carefully, not sure if she was just suggesting it out of some strange form of politeness. However, it seemed Shida was quite calm at the idea. Her posture was relaxed, with her arms casually crossed in front of her stomach. "Yeah, sure," she said, after less than a second of contemplation, and she glanced up at him with her visor projecting a candid face. "Might be the last chance you get." James didn't exactly know where her change might have come from. However, he couldn't deny a certain curiosity at the place that his girlfriend had called home for a large part of her life. Of course, he was fully aware that their conversation was far from private, and so he quickly glanced around at his surrounding colleagues and guards. "You're the boss here," Andrej near immediately replied to his inquiring gaze, having apparently paid quite close attention to his behaviour while they were walking. "At least this lets us schedule our takeoff," the pilot chimed in cheerfully, Bees waiting around at the port. Nobody else seemed to have objections either. "If you're going to kiss orphans, we should organise a camera team beforehand," Admit commented facetiously, turning his head towards James and earning himself a jab against his shoulder, which he just laughed off. James turned back towards Shida, who still looked at the buildings in the distance with that same candid expression on her face. "Lead the way," he said, after taking a quick breath to focus himself. There actually wasn't much of a way to be led, as most of the cram seemed to proceed in a line around a single street, around which the buildings formed high, unyielding walls that seemed almost like enormous crashing waves due to their flowing forms without sharp corners. The name Cramps was certainly understandable when walking through this part of the city. The towering walls of buildings filled with small flats serving as a home to countless Miat already gave off a rather claustrophobic feeling while walking through the streets, seeming almost like they were moving in on you. But that was nothing compared to the way that they funneled everyone having to traverse the space in between them into a sort of bottleneck, making most walk basically shoulder on shoulder with each other. The humans, in their dark uniforms and with their obscured faces, formed a slight exception, as most of the Miat tried their best to not bump into them, even in these cramped conditions. All the while, cars tore through the single street with quite frankly irresponsibly high speeds, paying absolutely no mind to the tightly packed pedestrians surrounding them on either side. James found himself inadvertently holding onto Shida's hand. Not that he wasn't used to masses of people, and he could deal with them just fine. Still, he wasn't the biggest fan of crowds this large, and a bit of reassurance couldn't hurt. The small personal bubble that their alienness afforded the humans certainly helped. Shida, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed, both by the amount of people and the speeding cars tearing through every now and then, all of which seemed to be determined to spend as little time as humanly, or Miatly possible in this part of the city. She traversed this chaos with all the intent of an office worker sitting at their desk and staring at their screen, which probably made sense given that this was what she had been dealing with on the daily, back when she was just a small child, like the ones in Zishadee's office. Finally, After a time of walking that must have felt a lot longer than it actually had been, Sheeta suddenly made a slight turn, quickly ushering the group into the small oasis of an outcrop, leading to the entrance of one of the many buildings, that didn't exactly seem different from any of the others to James. It had pretty much the exact same build, with no features distinguishing it that he could make out. However, Sheeta had been quite goal-oriented in her approach, so there was little doubt that this was indeed what they were looking for. It was unlikely that she would mistake the place she had spent her youth in. And while the tide of people kept moving along besides them, the group of humans looked at the nondescript entrance to the building. "This is the place?" Athena was the first to ask, apparently caring the least about trying to make the question sound appropriate. "Yep," Sheeta replied nonchalantly, and crossed her arms while she inspected the door. "What? Did you expect a palace?" "No," Adme chimed in, and scratched at his neck with an empty palm while staring at the entrance that seemed to be so ordinary around here. "But we expected something." James felt similarly. Hard to believe that this was an orphanage. Of course, not every orphanage had to be a huge, repurposed Victorian mansion or anything like that, but this really didn't look like anything. "It looked like something once we're inside," Sheeta commented, and immediately took her first step towards the door, although her progress was halted when James closed his hand a bit tighter around hers, and thus pulled her to a stop. "Wait, we can't just go in there," he said, baffled. "Why not?" Sheeta replied, looking back at him with a projection of honest confusion on her visor. James stumbled over his words a bit as he replied, "It's an orphanage and we're, well, that would be just weird, wouldn't it? To just go in there?" Sheeta sighed and now also closed her hand tighter around his, before giving it a good tug, and thus pulling him along towards the door. "You need to get over yourself," she said enthusiastically. "Besides, it's the middle of the day. Place is most likely empty anyway." And so, without much further chance to protest, she pulled James along into the place of her youth, Nyantaka's brat house.